concrete forms, so not abstract universals, but concrete universals. But why are they concrete? Because they're born within the things of which they're universals. So in that sense, they're, I'm going to use a term that Aristotle really wouldn't use for this, they're applied. They are, here's a term he would use, embodied. Another term he would use, actualized. So the way we tend to think of concrete universals is they're concrete, they have definition, determination, they have specificity about them, because they're no longer abstract. And the reason why they're no longer abstract is that now they've actually been put to use. They're actually realized in the world itself. So far, so good, make a little bit of sense. But Hegel's point throughout all of this is one he's got to argue for. We can't just, he can't just assert it and we accept it. The point he's going to argue throughout all of this is that universality is concrete, not simply because it's actualized, embodied, applied. It's concrete because it generates its own determinations. It generates its own determinations. It is, to put it in slightly different lingo, self-determining, right? It determines itself. It gives itself its own determinations. It doesn't get them by being applied to the world. It doesn't get them by being embodied in, animal doesn't get the concept of animal doesn't get concretion by virtue of being embodied in particular animals. That's the Aristotle response to Plato, very crudely put. Hegel's not talking about that really. I mean, he gets that. That's an important point for him. He thinks, that's an advance, right? To move from Plato to Aristotle, certainly an advance along the lines here. But what Aristotle doesn't give us, arguably, is an account of how the concretion of universality is a result of its own doing. Is the result of its own doing. And we can argue about that, that's why I said it's arguably. We can argue about that whether that's in Aristotle or not, right? We can talk about how that can be worked out in all sorts of different ways through the causes, or through dunamis and actuality, energeia, all that kind of stuff. We can talk about that. But for the moment, I just want to use that as a contrasting point to talk about what Hegel's going to say about the nature of determinate universality. These are all terms that are interchangeable. Determinate universality, concrete universality, the universal universality. Those are all ways in which you can talk about it. All right. So that's where we're headed. That's what we're going to be talking about with the judgment forms. That, in essence, is what all the judgment forms are about. I know you don't read through it and go, oh yeah, it's all about universality and how it's determining itself. But that is what the judgment forms are about, as I'll try to show you. And it is guaranteed, no doubt, it's what the syllogistic forms are all about. So all of that is trying to deepen that thought of what do we mean to think, what does it mean to think universality as the first moment, the first moment of the movement of the concept. Like the first moment of the movement of the concept. That it, to put it very simply, concrete universality is just universality particularizing itself into individuality. That's all it is. That's everything, though, because that's what everything is. All right. Make some sense a little bit? At least where we're headed? All right, so what I want to do is I want to come back, first of all, and talk a little bit of, just a couple things by way of review. Talk a little bit again about the project of the subjective logic, so let's come back and talk about that. I talked about that last time through 3 questions. I want to pose those 3 questions again. And then rather than kind of circuitously work our way through them, more directly just kind of review what I said about all 3 questions, so we have those in place again. Then I'll come back and talk about the universal in particular and the individual material that we discussed last time. And then that'll lead us into, because I'm going to spend a bit more time with singularity or the individual. I'll use those interchangeably, right? So individual and singular, I'm just using them interchangeably. Einzelheit, it's the same German term. So I'll be using those interchangeably as the same way of talking about that. But the discussion of that, right, both, as he says, the individual is both the return of the concept and the loss of the concept. The return of the concept and the loss of the concept. We want to talk about both of those moments. I want to talk about it in a little more detail than I did last time, and look at this notion of descending and ascending that he mentions there. We'll talk about that as a way of transitioning into the judgment forms themselves. Right? So remember, one of the things that Hegel accuses Kant of, we're going to talk about Kant as a kind of, that's the legacy in which we're working, the legacy of the transcendental logic. One of the things that Hegel always criticizes Kant about, Fichte criticizes Kant about this as well, so it's not just Hegel, but one of the things they criticize Kant about is he took over a table of judgment forms like this and didn't ever bother with trying to show what their relationship to one another was. He just said, look, here's the judgment forms, And now we need to talk about quality, quantity, relation, modality in terms of the categories of the conditions of experience, right? So the conditions of the possibility of objects, of representations, right, in a judgment are the conditions of the possibility of objects in representations themselves. That's the claim, that's the leading clue that he follows, Kant follows. And he just sweeps these over, that's Hegel's expression, without showing how they're related to one another. Well, as you know, Hegel is committed to showing why universality entails particularity, entails individuality, but doesn't stop there. Why all of that entails necessarily these judgment forms. And why each one of these judgment forms entails the next one. And why all of them together obviously entail the syllogistic forms and so on and so forth. So that project of showing how one category, one judgment form or one syllogistic form or one moment in the term logic that he's exploring here entails the next is all the way through. He's committed to that all the way through. All right. Questions, problems, or issues about any of that, just broadly speaking? Then let's come back and look at these three questions again. So here's the three questions just to remind you. First question is, why does the subjective logic begin with a section devoted to subjectivity? Just what does that term subjectivity even mean here? We talked about this last time. Of course, I want us to come back and reaffirm that. So that's the first question. Second question is, why is classical formal logic, that is the term logic, the logic of concept, judgment, and syllogism, not the predicate logic we use today, but the term logic of the time, why is that the set of formal categories and structures that articulate the immanent logic of the generative process of manifestation? Why is that the right set of formal structures? Why shouldn't we be appealing to something else? Why isn't there a different logic, right, that we should be appealing to? Not a formal logic, maybe a very material logic of some kind or another that you could find in someplace else? Or why are we appealing to something at all? Why isn't it just immanent to the concept itself, and it has its own unique, special logic that's not really elaborated in any other kind of special, let's call it discipline, like formal logic or other modes of scientific inquiry? So why does the formal logic get us to this? And then finally, third question, what can this logic tell us? And just as importantly, what can it not tell us? You know both, right? What can it tell us, but also what can it not tell us about the immanent structure of the process of manifestation? That's what we're supposed to be figuring out here, right? So what does it tell us? What can it tell us? And then also what can it not? What's the limits of this term logic? What can it give us? What can it not give us? So let's go. I went circuitously through the second question, through the first, back to the third last time. Let me not do that this time. Let me give you a more abbreviated review by going straight through all three questions, right? So in order. So let's take the first question first, nominally. Why does this subjective logic begin with a section devoted to subjectivity? What do we even mean by subjectivity here? So we said last time that subjectivity in the science of logic does not refer to self-consciousness or some kind of intentional agency. We know that in the polemical sections, right, I'm talking about, there's this passage on 5:15 at the bottom. We looked at it last time. I'll not belabor us here. Bottom of 5:15 to top of 5:16. This is 18 and 19 in the German. We know there's a passage there where Hegel clearly compares the speculative logic that he's doing in this book with the transcendental logic in Kant, right? He literally, alludes to Kant's the leading clue passage, and he seems to be very clearly, modeling or thinking about his own speculative logic in terms of that transcendental logic. And it has, yes, a kind of, as I said last time, a Fichtean inflection, right? Because whereas Kant would say, well, this is the transcendental logic that gives us the conditions of the possibility of objects for us, Fichte will say, there's actually nothing else than for us, right? There's nothing in itself, right? There is no real in itself. This is early Fichte. There's nothing in itself. So the for us of an object just is its very being, right? So to be posited, this is the way Fichte would put this, right? To be posited just means to create that thing, for it to be at all, to place it there, to set it there. To setzen is to place something before you. Well, here it is. It's being placed. These objects are being placed before us. And Hegel reads his own speculative logic as a kind of inheritor of that same project that you see in the transcendental logic in Kant. You can see in the Fichtean version of that, revision of that, in particularly the first version of the Wissenschaftslehre, but elsewhere in Fichte as well. But we know that those polemical sections, those historical comparative sections, are not the systematic answer to that question. It's not Hegel's considered systematic view about the matter. He's doing comparison, as he always does in these polemical settings. He's saying, well, look, if you need some historical comparisons, here you go. But don't anchor into these, right? Don't latch onto them and think, oh, now I know the answers. You've got a crutch is what you've got, something to help you, but don't be tricked by the crutch, right? Because the crutch will take you down the route of saying, oh, I know what the concept is. The concept is transcendental unity of apperception, right? That's what it is. And so is self-consciousness. That's why he's talking about subjectivity here. But what he tells you when he starts to formulate systematically, this is in the division section. So I'm looking now at the passage on 5:26-27. This is on pages 29 in the German and following. There he very clearly says, when he wants to formulate, look, why are we talking about, subjectivity, then objectivity, then idea? That's the 3 chapters of the subjective logic. Why are we talking about, this is his other term for this, right? Why are we talking about the formal concept, the real concept, and the adequate concept? That's the way he also elaborates those same 3 sections. He formulates that not in terms of the transcendental logical Kant, or the Fichtean revision of that. He formulates it in terms of the problematic of truth, material truth. So not the truth of an assertion and does it or does it not correspond to a state of affairs, but material truth in the sense of, does the state of affairs actually embody its concept? Does the state of affairs we're interested in here ultimately is, being, everything that is insofar as it is. So when and where does being actually fully and completely embody its concept? Well, when it's adequate to its concept. That's why he calls it the adequate concept. But that's the idea. That's the idea. So why are we talking at first? What are we talking about at first? We're talking about the concept, he says. But we're talking about, and here it's almost like he's getting away with something, right? Because he says, well, at this point we're just talking about the concept of the concept. Now clearly, right, the concept of the concept, the first concept means we're not talking about what it is as it's fully and completely worked out. This is what he means by formal. Right? But that second term, the concept of the concept, right, he is talking about, well, this is what we're going to be talking about throughout the rest of the logic. We're talking about this process. So what he'll do to try to alert you to this, he'll say, well, look, what we're talking about here is the concept not as it yet is true fully, true in the sense of completely and fully determining of being itself. Or another way of putting that, we're talking about the concept when it's not yet objective. But it's not yet objective means it's not yet adequate, right? Because to be objective is at least to be on the way to being adequate. It can't be adequate if it's not at least objective. So before it's objective, this is what we're talking about here in this first section, the subjectivity chapter. This we're talking about it in its formal designation. Its formal designation. That is, simply as the rules of thinking. Not yet as the rules of being. Very, very broadly, very simply. The rules of thinking, denken. Not yet the rules of sein, not yet the rules of being itself. So that's his answer to the question, what do we mean by subjectivity here? It's a very strange answer in the sense of, really it turns out that subjective in this context doesn't mean what we normally mean by subjective. It doesn't mean what it has historically meant in the tradition, right, even. Right? Because we would say, Fichte is, at least early Fichte is a subjective idealist, right? So subjectivity, the I is I, the ego, that's the centerpiece of all of that. He's really expanding on this notion of the transcendental unity of apperception in Kant already. So that's what we mean by subjectivity. And yeah, that isn't my personal interiority, right? That we know that. It's a transcendental ego of which we all are, emblematic in some way. But it's a formal principle, already is that in Kant. But Hegel's saying, no, it's really, we're not talking about it as any kind of subjectivity, any kind of ego at all. That's not what we mean by subjectivity here. What we mean by subjectivity here is nothing other than the formalness, the formality, the formalness of this concept. Not yet objective, not yet adequate. So think of it in those terms, and you've got a better handle on it. than you would otherwise have. You've got at least a systematic division between the formal concept, the real concept, and the adequate concept, which is the structuring of the chapter overall. All right, make a little bit of sense? There's still, right, notice, he is still slipping in there the idea that we're going to talk about the formal nature of the concept, and to talk about the formal nature of the concept, what are we going to talk about? Formal logic, the rules of thinking. Well, thinking is something we do as subjects, so there is a connection there, but he's just not going all the way full down and saying subjectivity is the end-all, be-all of the locus of all things. It's not the originator of all things. Make some sense? Now don't forget, he's also entitled this entire book, right, this portion of the book, this volume of the book, right, volume 3, the subjective logic, or the doctrine of the concept. So how does that work? We'll come back to that later. All right, so that leads us to the question then, okay, well, if we're talking about the rules of thinking, and that's the rules of formal logic, then second question, why must formal logic be the formal categories that we're after here, that reveal the movement of the concept itself? And again, the reference to in the polemical sections would take us to Kant, right? Because Kant draws this distinction, we talked about this last time, between, as he calls them, classical formal logic, applied general logic. One's a priori, classical formal logic is an a priori discipline. Applied general logic is an a posteriori science. It's how, given a mind, how does it work, how does it reason? We're interested, of course, in transcendental logic. What does it do? It takes the clue from classical formal logic, an a priori discipline, which was not tied to objects. And transcendental logic says, well, here's what the rules of the conditions of the possibility of objects are a priori. So there's its model. That's Kant's project in a broad nutshell. And Hegel will say, well, there's something right about that. Right? There's something right about that. Now, where Kant goes with that is problematic, because he takes it to a highly abstract, highly formalized ego, but that is where he goes with it. That's what the transcendental unity of apperception really turns out to be. And the rules that govern its synthetic activity are the rules that are disclosed in formal logic, right? It's the rules that govern judgment forms. Right? So Kant is really all about judgment forms. He really doesn't care about syllogisms. That's where you get illusion from. He really doesn't care about concepts in themselves, right? So he really is focused on judgment. So you can always say for Kant, right, if you want to understand the nature of cognition, you want to understand the nature of experience more broadly, Kant fundamentally thinks of the human mind as a judging apparatus. It makes judgments about the world. And because there are rules that govern that judging activity, then those rules are not just rules for the judging activity, they're actually rules for the cognition activity more broadly, the cognitive activity more broadly. There's the First Critique's fundamental project in a nutshell, right? Is that kind of hinging on, well, if we can see doing this in formal logic, then we can see what it will do at a transcendental logic. The difference is not the a priori status, they're both a priori. The difference is that transcendental logic has to do with objects of experience, formal logic doesn't. So Hegel comes into that and says, there's something right in what Kant was doing. That leading clue was a valid leading clue. I think Hegel signs on to that, right? This is problematic in a lot of ways, let me acknowledge that, right? He's signing on to a kind of leading clue. He doesn't think you can leave it at a leading clue. That's what he accuses Kant of doing, just taking and running with the clue, never once actually demonstrating why the clue does what it's supposed to do. So Hegel thinks that you can take the leading clue. There's something right about the rules of thought being the rules of being. There's the Fichtean inflection of that, right? Not just objects of experience, but objects to court, objects as they are as such. So Hegel will say, well, there's something right about that. But what Kant and Fichte both, frankly, owed us, and neither one, though Fichte better, repaid or paid off on, was the claim that, well, you have to be able to show that those formal structures actually give you this. You can't just assert that they do and then run with that. That's Kant. You can't assert that they do and then start deriving things from the I equals I, the I equals the not I, which is the beginnings of the Wissenschaftslehre and the first version of the Wissenschaftslehre in Fichte. What you've got to do is you've got to take the concepts and unpack them into one another, show, if they do, how they unfold into one another necessarily. And I'll come back to this later, non-relationally. because I want to push this point a little more at this juncture. I think it deserves it. As I've said many, many times at this point, I'm sure you're sick and tired of hearing it, the objective logic is the logic of relationality. It's a relational ontology. Right? Everything there ultimately is about the relationship between essence and being. It's about the thing and its properties. It's about the world in itself, the world of appearances. It's all about these relations that a thing has with one relata relating to another relata. Yes? So we talk about that in terms of the essential relation, where one is more fundamental than the other, one's the ground of the other. The absolute relation, which is what we're talking about with subjects and accidents and cause and effect and reciprocity. Those are all absolute relations. But at the end of the day, the objective logic through and through, up until its last moment, and it peaks through repeatedly, but it never really becomes just this. It is always ultimately relational. Until, as we've seen, those relations ultimately point to something that generates them, that is a process that generates them, which is not itself relational. So one of the points that Hegel's going to continually make here that's relevant to this formal logic question is that the categories of formal logic, when we talk about universality, particularity, individuality, when we talk about all these different judgment forms, when we talk about all the syllogistic forms, Hegel's point is going to be about this is the term he uses in the introduction for it, introduction to the subjective logic. He says, you have to take these dead bones, these dry bones of formal logic, right? He calls them once they're emaciated, right? And you've got to see them as fluid. Now, that's the last thing that anybody looking at these forms is going to think, right? I mean, when you look at that table, you don't go, yeah, I see fluidity there. You're going to say, I see categorization, right? I see some of them categorized, just to use these, as existence judgment forms, reflective judgment forms, necessity judgment forms, concept judgment forms. That's categorization. You're putting things under different governing rubrics. And that's all that's going on. But Hegel wants to say that what formal logic actually reveals, much against our natural inclinations, the common misconception is this, is that it's not relational moments, right? It's not, just to use the judgment forms that we'll talk about today, we'll come back to a different version of this in the syllogisms. It's not about the subject and the predicate being related to one another. Now, clearly, that's what judgment forms are about, right? Every judgment form is S is P, and a variation on that in terms of the terms that go into it. That's all the judgment forms operate. But Hegel's point about them is that they're not ultimately relational. They're about the fluidity of the subject necessarily becoming the predicate necessarily becoming the subject through the copula. As I told you last time, the copula is the centerpiece of his account of the judgment forms for that reason. But we're already there, right? If you think about it, we were talking about this last week. He didn't want to talk about universality, particularity, and individuality as three relata. Right? They're not related to one another. That's his whole point, right? They're not related to one another. There's not universality and, oh yeah, you can't really do universality without particularity, so you're going to need a little bit of that, a little bit of that ingredient thrown in. Oh yeah, and then if you do that, you'll eventually get, the third relata, you'll get individuality, you'll get singularity. That's what issues out if you punch these things all together. His point is that universality just is the flow into particularization. There is no universality that isn't particularization. That's what defines universality, is particularization. He calls it at one moment, we'll look at this passage again in just a second, he calls particularity the finitizing of universality, the finitizing of universality. He goes back and grabs that term back from the logic of being, finitizing. But he immediately tells you, this isn't a transition into something else. This isn't something and other, where the other imposes a limit on the something, and then that limit has to constantly be overcome, the finitizing, right? Constantly overcoming of the limit, the transgressing of the limit. Well, what is it then? Well, he says, universality is finitized not by something that's beyond it, but it finitizes itself, because it's self-differentiating. So there is no universality, not just, I struggle to find terms for this, right? Without particularity, that's the wrong way, because that makes it sound like you got to have the two together. Hegel's point is universality just is particularization. And particularization just is universality. They're not two distinct relata. They are literally names for the same thing going on. They're different aspects of it, yes, but they're names for the same thing. And no surprise, individuality is not a third term. Right? I know we call this a term logic, rightly so, but it's really not a third term. It's just a name for what all those things are doing when they reach a kind of stage of completion, returns into itself, but also a stage of they can be lost at that point. They can be abstracted, extracted out, and rendered abstract at that point, rendered particular at that point. That's the loss of it. So Hegel's point here about formal logic is not just let's go get the leading clue, like Kant did for the transcendental logic, take that over from formal logic and say, let's go. His point is, let's take that leading clue, because there's something right about it. There's something about the rules of thinking that can get us to the rules by which the concept operates. But you can't take them over in their purely ossified, rigidified, abstracted, fixed version. You've got to show how they flow into one another, how they are fluid, so that they're not relational, they're processional, just to be very simplistic about it. And that's why you can't define universality without particularity and particularity without individuality, not because those three moments are embedded in one another, but because they are literally nothing other than what each other are. So they're not three related. They're not like the thing and its properties. Right? The thing and its properties, even the substance and its accidents, those are distinguishable from one another. You could say that the thing bears its properties. It's the ground of them. You could even say that the substance bears its accidents. That's a little bit of essential relation thrown back into absolute relation. And Hegel says that can't happen at that level, right? But substance is nothing other than actuosity, accidentality. It just is the emitting of, the generating of accidents. That's all it really ever is. There is no substance, right? So, the kind of Lockean thing where he says, substance, I know not what. Hegel's like, right, because there's nothing. It just is this production of properties. That's all, this production of effects, this production of accidents. That's all it is. But notice, that's still relational talk. It's becoming less and less able to solidify the relationality. There's no substance underlying the properties, no pincushion underlying all the properties sitting on top of it, right? So the model you get from modern modern rationalism. But Hegel's saying no, that's processional. It's got to be thought processional. That's what it means to think universality particularizing itself is individuality. That same issue is being elaborated now in the judgment forms. We'll talk about why and how in just a little bit. So I think that takes us to our third question. So why formal logic? Because formal logic gives us this insight, but not just taken over willy-nilly, taken over wholesale, taken over as it is. We've got to take it over and show, if it can be shown, how this term logic actually entails and flows into its next moment, because that's then will give us what we really are hoping to get here, if we can get it, which is what's the rule governance of the process of the generative process of the concept. It's one thing, right? I think it's worth reminding ourselves. It's one thing, we could have stopped here and said, there is this process called the concept. It generates all that is. All the related, so you're like at the end of the objective logic. You could just stop there and go, there's this process. It throws off all of these. It produces, it causes, it brings about all these relata that we've investigated in all of the logic of being, the logic of essence, all quality, measure, all the stuff about essentialities and how they're related to being and existence and all that kind of wonderful stuff, thing, properties, world in itself, world, all those kinds of wonderful things. It does all of that. And then you could say, and man, is it a mystery. Isn't it wonderful? Isn't it amazing? But I got no clue of how it operates on its own terms. That is a kind of something that goes on that we just need to stand in awe of, because our minds are not equipped sufficiently to be able to grasp that. Here's where reason ends. Here's where something beyond reason has to intercede, because we can't go there, right? We have to have something display this to us, present this to us, that's not in rational, demonstrative, argumentative form. There is no rule governance to it that we can discern. It just operates as it operates. And the best we can, I'm going to be very blunt about this, but I think it's worth making this distinction here. We would just have to stop and say, the best we can do here is tell stories about it. that that's what mythology is, that that's what religion broadly construed is. I'm giving you later Schelling. This is what Schelling claims about the nature of being, that you can't know it rationally. Right? All you can know, I'm giving you a kind of Hegel version of Schelling, right? So forgive me for that. But Schelling clearly says, this is the positive philosophy of later Schelling. Schelling says, look, we can't know being in itself. You just have to accept that that is. That's intuitive, right? So this goes all the way back to Hölderlin, where Hölderlin says you have to have intellectual intuition to grasp the oneness of being, which is prior to any kind of identity, fundamentally the identity of self-consciousness, for example. So this oneness that subtends all things, the union that subtends all things, you have to grasp that through intellectual intuition. And Schelling, it seems to me, picks up on that. Not just me, lots of people think this. Schelling picks up on that and says, well, you know what, that's right. Intellectual intuition is what grants our grasping of being itself. Not our rationalization. We can't, there's no demonstrations, there's no argumentation to be made about it. You grasp it. And eventually, for a while in Schelling's itinerary, that's where he left it. He just said you have to have intellectual grasp of the nature of reality. And then from that, you can do all sorts of reasoning, but you got to have that, that's your prerequisite, that's what you start from. But eventually he said, you know, we do have ways of disclosing what we grasp in intellectual intuition. The ways we disclose that is through myth and religion. Broadly speaking, we tell ourselves stories. And I don't mean to be condescending about it in that way, right? Those stories are very revelatory because they're not argumentative, right? That Zeus did something on Mount Olympus one day, that's not argumentative, right? It's not if-then reasoning. But it is very helpful to say, well, here's how everything began. Zeus was on Mount Olympus, and there was a war going on, you know, to tell us that story of origins, you know, Hesiod telling us those kinds of stories. Or we could go to other kinds of religious mythology, and that would tell us, this is Schelling's reading of these things would tell us about this stuff. Because why? Because reason can't go any further than this. So you could go all the way up to the objective logic. You could read that as a Schellingian. You could read that as, you know, a Jacobian, frankly. You could read all that and say, okay, yeah, right, your point is that there's all this, that the world is a world of relations that's generated out of a creative process. But that creative process, what is it? We don't know. We don't know. The best we can do is tell ourselves stories about it. And we've been doing that for centuries. Right? So let's look back through those and try to figure those out as insights into what this creative process is. But what we'll never get to in any of that, right? Because notice, this is not what that project is. What we'll never get to in any of those stories is an actual rational account of the nature, fundamental rule-governed nature of the process of creativity that generates all things. Make some sense? Now, I say all that because that's clearly not what Hegel's doing, right? Hegel thinks that formal logic is the rule-governed account of how the process of the concept generates all things. So Hegel wants to say, you know, I think reason can take that step. We can have what I called in the phenomenology, you know, absolute knowing. That means knowing the absolute, not knowing pretty close to the absolute, but then giving it up at the end, which is his, you know, derogatory way of depicting what, you know, Kant did and what the Romantics did after him, and of course what Schelling left us with, right? You know, you can't know anything. This is the night in which all cows are black, right? You've got to ultimately have the oneness of all things, but then you don't know how anything is differentiated because you don't have any way of accounting for how differentiation takes place. You don't have Hegel's term, logic of the absolute itself. Well, Hegel is saying, yeah, you had your finger on it, Kant. You had your finger on it, Victor. You were right there. What you didn't do is go the next step, which is, okay, formal logic can tell us about the logic of the concept, the logic of the generative process by which all things are what they are, and are, then what is that logic? Well, you have to walk through the logic itself. Well, that means you have to look at it initially, at least, on its own, formally. Without its embodiedness, yes, without its generation of content, without its objectivity yet. So you look at it purely in these rule-governed, right? These are all rules. But it's a rule governance of a process. Here's the tension, right? You're looking at a structure, and you're also talking about that's a structure of genesis that's part of a generative process. So it's use a loaded term, not Hegel's terms, generative structure. That's what Hegel's trying to elaborate here as I see it in the subjectivity chapter, but ultimately all throughout the logic of the concept itself. So what can the formal logic, what can it tell us? What can the term logic say? Here's the third question. So that's why the formal logic. Right? Notice what that basically says is this, is that we're going to take it as our leading clue, but we're not going to accept it merely as a leading clue. We're going to take it as our leading clue, right, Kant, but we're not going to let it do all its work because it's our leading clue. Why? Because that would be a presupposition. Then we'd be saying all hail formal logic. Right? You're right and because you're right. You don't need to have yourself demonstrated in any kind of way. The subjectivity chapter is the unpacking of and the demonstration thereby of the rule-governed process that is what formal logic is trying to tell us about, he thinks. So what can that logic tell us and what can't it tell us? What can formal logic tell us and what can't it tell us? This is a way of saying, okay, what's all this about concept, judgment, and syllogism? What is it there to give us? I've tried to say a little bit about that already. But what can it not tell us? So think about what it can tell us. What it can tell us, as I just said, is it can give us the rules by which the generative process of the concept operates. So now it's not a mystery. Right? Now it's not something that can only be disclosed, revealed, displayed to us, represented to us by mythology and religion. Here now, we've got a rational account of it. Do we also have it in mythology and religion? Hegel will go, sure you do. Of course you do. But that's because they have a rational content to themselves. This is Hegel's famous line about, both religion, mythology you can put in here as well, religion and philosophy have the same content, but they have different forms. Same content, the concept. So if you ask, what is mythology about, ultimately? Whether you're talking about Zeus, God, many gods, doesn't matter. What are they about? They're ultimately about the concept. That's what they're trying to explain. They're trying to explain how all things are what they are. That's ultimately, in that sense, all mythologies, all philosophies are ultimately origin stories about how the nature of reality became reality, how the nature of reality took place. But Hegel wants to say that the form is different. The form in mythology and religion is that. It's trying to give you that, of course. But it gives you that in a symbolic and narratival form. It's called picture thinking, representation, Vorstellung, right? We display things, we show you these things, we say, here's Zeus, here's God, here's whatever. And here they did this thing. There's a symbol, and now you have a narrative going on. You go, oh yeah, and then on the third day, right, that sort of narratival presentation. But it's about the concept. That's really what it's talking about. It doesn't call it the concept. It calls it God or Zeus or whatever, but it's about the concept. The difference with philosophy is that it's about the concept too, but it's got a different form. Its form is what? Its form is the concept adequate to the concept itself. It's giving a theoretical, rational presentation that's not contingent. Every story is contingent. It could have gone another way. Zeus could have lost the battle one day. Athena could have risen higher. Things like this could have happened. Those are all contingencies. But that's not how philosophy operates. Philosophy operates with necessity. The necessity of the concept. It's literally Hegel's short definition for what is philosophy, right? Philosophy is the demonstration of the necessity of the concept. And so here's where we get that. Right? It's precisely here. And so what you're seeing in the subjective logic, what you're seeing in the doctrine of the concept more broadly, is an attempt to give the rule-governed structure that governs the process of generation itself. It's what produces all the relata that we talked about in the logic of being, the logic of essence. So that's what it can tell us. What can it not tell us? It on its own, the formal logic on its own, what it can't tell us is what that process actually looks like, what it actually does, how it actually operates in being. It can't give us that on its own. That's why there's a subjectivity, and then there's an objectivity chapter. We've got to look at what the formal logic is. So what's the rules of this process? And well, you say, what's the rules of the process that generates everything that is? That's right. But you can't see how it does that. You can't see what it is in doing that just in terms of formal logic. It remains formal. It remains abstracted. It remains subjective. So Hegel's going to make an argument. It's going to come at the end of the syllogism chapter. We'll look at it very closely next week and the following week because it's, monstrous like that. It deserves that kind of attention. He's going to argue that a particular kind of syllogism necessarily entails objectivity. That a particular kind of syllogism isn't just, it is this, a way of thinking, inferring, right, arguing. Of course it's that. But it's not just that. That when you get to this syllogistic form, it actually can't just be that. It is that, but it can't just be that. It entails that it's more than that it's actually objective. That's a lot. That's the demonstration that subjectivity necessarily is objectivity, that this formal structure entails content. But that's precisely the argument he's making there, and that's the move now to talk about what he calls not just the formal concept, but the real concept, objectivity. The concept as it is generative in being itself. So we'll come back to this. But what that means, the formal logic can't tell us on its own, is what necessarily the generation of the content of being and essence will be, and how that actually operates on its own terms. So, you're going to read, as you are now, reading these concept, judgment, and syllogism, and you're going to be looking and go, okay, Kevin's been telling us a lot, all the time, about this claim that the movement of the concept is what generates all the relata that we looked at in the logic of being and logic of essence. So all that qualitative, quantitative measure stuff and all the stuff that proceeds from that, that's all generated out of this process. And you're going to go, where in here, right, where in the formal logic stuff do we see that actually happening? Answer, nowhere. Nowhere. And yet, those processes governed by those rules are going to entail objectivity, and because they entail objectivity, then and there, in the objectivity chapter, he will address this question, okay, where do you get quality, quantity, relation, modality, all that kind of stuff, where does it come from? It comes from these processes, now seen as processes that are objective, not just formal, not just subjective. Make a little bit of sense? Questions? Yeah, John.
I have a question just on the transition still.
Yeah. Transition from?
Into the
subjective
the
law.
judgment.
Yeah.
From the concept.
Okay, we'll come back to this in a second.
So
go ahead. No, go ahead and ask it. Let's get it on the table.
Okay, it's just, were you describing his argument for the transition into why we need to talk about judgments as the hint that is big, like seems to only be relying on what we talked about last time, which is the Tylung and the Is that the only argument he gives at that point?
I don't see that as an argument.
Well, it's not, but
right.
Is that but
it's a cute name for
right yeah.
what he thinks he's argued to.
I guess I don't see where he provides though.
Exactly.
What is the, okay.
So where is the Tylung? Where is the originary separation? Right. And that's a nice thing to say. Oh well, look, we've now reached. This is roughly what he does, right? We've now reached the originary separation, the originary partition, right? And what is that? That's the Urteilen. So what is that? That's Urteil. That's judgment in German. So now we talk about judgment. So one of the ways that that oftentimes that transition, other transitions in Hegel are talked about this way is, he's making transitions through wordplay, right? Which is not a substantive actual demonstration of anything. It's just, I found a word, and so the word does this, and so now we can move on. False etymology. We can now move on through this false etymology to something else. That's the worst kind of way of thinking about it. It's reasonable. I'm going to try to show that I don't think that's what he's doing there, right? But we got to get there, and we'll come back and talk about precisely that. What is this originary separation? Right? That's the kind of key thing that he names with Urteil. And then he thinks, that's what judgment really is trying to talk about, is that. Because you now got things that are relatable to one another that you didn't have before. So now you can talk about a subject is related to a predicate through a copula. That's what judgment forms are all about. But you first have to talk about how do you separate out something that could take the place of subject, something that could take the place of being predicate and then related to one another through the copula. So that's where we got to hit. Make sense of that, yeah. But that's not the objectivity question. Notice that's a different thing, right?
Yeah, yeah.
It's a different
I'm
transition.
just wondering how you were reading it, because that's obviously not a necessary transition, but you were saying that there is a necessary transition, that's just not the necessary
Yeah,
transition.
yeah.
Okay.
I think there's a necessity to that transition.
Okay.
Yeah. Amir.
So I'm thinking on the question on the primacy of things and primacy of concepts.
Yeah.
So Hegel's subjective logic makes this distinction, the radical separation between things and concepts,
Yeah.
inoperative in a way,
Yeah.
through the adequate concept, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. That's when the concept comes into its fruition, when it comes to be complete unto itself, and that's when it fully is objective.
So we are not talking about, in Hegel's view, any primacy of concepts or the concept with a big C, or primacy of things. There's no primacy.
Yeah,
Is there a primacy of the concept?
here's the only thing I'm hesitant about there, right? It depends on what you mean by primacy. So if what you mean by primacy is the concept is the ground of being an essence, then no, right? Because to assert it as a ground would mean you've returned, the essential relation is returned, right? That now the concept takes the position that we originally thought the essence was supposed to have, that of a ground. And it's now really the ground that makes possible being an essence, right? So it stands in a kind of primacy over and above or deeper than, however you want to think about the metaphorics of it, than being an essence. But Hegel's claim is that the concept is the truth of being an essence, but it's not the ground in that sense. It's not the ground of being an essence because it's not over and above, more fundamental and deeper than them. Why isn't it? Because it's what generates them from within them. It's not separable from them. It doesn't stand over above them or underneath them in any kind of way like ground does. So you can't think of it as the foundation or ground in those classical senses. Yes? However, it is the truth of the other two. So it does have a kind of primacy or a priority over being an essence. It is more fundamental than them because it is the ultimate process that generates them themselves. So it's not a ground, it doesn't have that kind of primacy, but it is nonetheless, does have a primacy in this sense that it's not a ground, but it is nonetheless the immanent generative source of what all those things are. And that's what he means by the adequate concept. Does that help with that?
Yes.
So I'm giving you some, and I'm also taking away, and I know that's frustrating, but I think that that's accurate to what Hegel's doing. It is clearly the case that he doesn't think that the concept is the ground of being an essence, in the classical sense, the way he's understood ground even. But it does have a kind of truth that it articulates that the other two are inadequate to. So it has a primacy in that sense. Yeah. There was another question. Oh yeah, well, sorry.
Just you kept reiterating now that there's no objectivity in today's reading.
Yeah.
And that just touches on something a term that I was particularly confused by while reading this reading.
Yeah.
You keep saying objective meaning.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you can help me out.
Yeah, so he's trying to say, what does he mean by objective meaning there? He's trying to say, I'll come back and talk about this in just a little bit, that there's a distinction to be made between something you can assert is the case, S is P, no, I'm telling you S is P, and that be true for me, the asserter. That's its subjective meaning, this is what it means for me. And he says, but you could always contrast that, couldn't you, with its objective meaning, what it really means itself. And he wants to say that I'm not worried about what the asserter's meaning is. So this isn't an intentional analysis of logic. I don't care what your intentions are when you're saying S is P. We're putting out of operation for our purposes. You can do this all day long, and you should when you're doing formal logic, right? It's relevant there. But when you're looking at just logical form itself, you put out of operation the judger. Sorry. I thought I had that turned off. So you put out of operation the judger, right? And you let it just be what it is unto itself. And in that sense, you're looking at its objective meaning. So that's what he means by objective meaning. This is what it is, irregardless of how it's being used in a particular linguistic assertive context. Is that Make some sense? That's the distinction between subjective and objective there. It's not yet all the way to, and here's what it is in being, which is what he means by objective later. But here it's just objective in the sense that it's not dependent on the particular asserter who's making these utterances, making these proclamations.
So it's opposed to subjective, not in the sense of subjectivity that you've been talking about.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that's right. All right. Other questions? We'll cut you off. These are excellent questions. All right. Then let's just remind ourselves of what he does with universality, particularity, individuality, and then we'll focus on individuality, and then that'll transition us into judgment itself. So remember what he says about universality. I'll just be brief about this. We went through these in more detail last time. What he says about universality is nothing other than the creative power that produced. So that's referring back to this moment in the logic of substance where he says, well, if you really want to think about what substance is, it's causal power. What's it the causal power to do? The causal power to produce effects, right? Produce effects. So he calls it here, picking up on that terminology, and where he got to at the end, he says, well, the only thing you really mean by universality is the free power, the self-engendering power, right? It's producing its own effects, and produces itself in producing those effects. That's what we're talking about. So that's the creative power. That's what universality is. That's all it is. And that means that it's just particularization. It just differentiates itself. That's all it is. There's nothing else to it other than this bare identity it maintains in producing differentiation of itself. So it doesn't scatter itself into oblivion, never to be recovered. It is itself in and through producing these differentiations. But that then takes us to particularity, right? So there is no universality without particularization. I always like to talk about the particular concept in terms of a process here because it's exactly the way he thinks about it, particularization. And he says, if you think about particularization, it means two things. It means particularity as totality and particularity as principle. So totality just means, look, there's all this proliferation of differentiation that comes out of universality. All differentiation comes out of, all particularization comes out of universality. And that means that universality abides in, we'll come back and be more specific about how this works, but it abides in, for the moment, let's use that term, universality then abides in all those particularizations. They're all elements of moments within universality itself. They are universality. They're not set over against it, they're not related to it. They are it. They're identified with it. So when he calls it a totality, he's saying, look, when particularization takes place, every last bit of that particularization is a moment within this whole called universality. But the whole is not something over and above, right, that subsumes and takes in or that bears all these particular moments. It just is those particular moments. It is particularization itself. And that's why he calls it, this is where he uses that phrase where he says, this is finitizing itself. Right? This is finitizing itself. It's not something it's related to, it's something that it is itself. But he also says, so that's the totality side, right? So every particular is universality differentiating itself. There is no particularity that isn't that happening. But then he wants to say, particularity is not only the totality, but it's also the principle. Now that's the harder one to get. I submit that the first one is just like, okay, look, particularity is the full exhaustion of universality. Just is universality expressing itself all over the damn place. Every bit of particularity you can think of and experience and encounter that ever could be, yeah, that's universality doing that. Universality is not absent from it. That didn't, oh look, one of the particulars escaped, right? No. It is just another moment of universality. That's what universality is that particularization. So that's the totality claim. But he then wants to say, it's not only totality, but it's also principle. Now, I think this is really important for Hegel, and this is why he's straining terms here, because principle is a weird term to use here. Right? Let's just admit that, because what he means by principle is rule. Rule. So he's saying particularity is not just the totality of universality, but it's also the rule of universality. What does that mean? Well, as he says here for you, this is on 534 in the translation, 37 in the German. So take a look at this is on 534. And this is, this is the, right in the middle of the page, or kind of just down below the middle of the page, where he writes, this totality inasmuch as the determinateness of the particular is taken as mere diversity. Everybody see where I'm at? So he writes, this totality, inasmuch as the determinateness of the particular is taken as mere diversity, appears as completeness. So everything that is this. So diversity, when we point around, when it's taken as diversity, when we say, God, there's a lot of diverse things around us, Hegel wants to say, right, but that diversity is not, as we saw it in the logic of essence, it's not given. Right? It's not just something, it's not a feature of existence, and then we have to abstract from that, which is what we're doing in the logic of essence. Here, it's a production, right? It's produced by universality itself. That's what diversity is. And he says, it is appears as completeness. It's everything that is. That's totality. But then look what he does with that. In this respect, the species are complete simply insofar as there are no more of them. Kind of an amazing statement. What that means is there is nothing over and above the specification of universality. Right? There's no overarching genus, right, that subsumes all the particular species. That's how, there's no covering concept. That's the normal way in which we understand the genus to relate to species. They're the covering concept. They overtake, subsume all the lower level species under them. Human, the various kinds of human, that kind of thing, right? But that's not what's going on here. He's saying this is not a subsumptive relationship between particularity and universality. He says, it's when you've reached this, there is just no more of them. It's exhausted. It's exhausted. There is no inner standard or principle available for them, for their diversity is just the dispersed difference for which the universality, which is for itself absolute unity, is a merely external reflex in an unconstrained contingent completeness. But diversity, he's rehearsing now from the logic of essence, but diversity passes over into opposition, into an immanent relation of diverse moments. So we know how that story goes, right? When we just have diversity, you can say, well, things are alike and they're unalike, and there's the opposition, and then opposition leads to contradiction, and we know the story from the logic of essence. But look at then what he does. But diversity passes over into opposition, into an immanent relation of diverse moments. So far, so good in the logic of essence. But then he says, particularity, however, this is always Hegel's way of saying, that's not how things are now. That's his alert, right? Heads up, things are different now. We're in the logical concept. Diversity is not something given anymore. It's not something just laying around to be found out there. Particularity, however, because it is universality, there it is. Particularity, however, because it is universality, it's not related to universality, it is universality, it's an identitarian claim. Is this immanent relation, it's what we talked about in the logic of essence, as a relation between the diverse, the opposite, the contradictory, how does that relate to identity? Right, that's the problematic there. Is this immanent relation not by virtue of a transition, it was still that in the logic of essence, a transition, but in and of itself, it is totality, intrinsically and simple determinateness, essential principle. Well, that means what he just said is that particularity is not something that you relate universality to, it's the rule that governs universality. That there is no universality unless it's particularizing itself, that's all that it is. So when he calls it a principle, odd term to use, right? But nonetheless, what he's saying there is that this is what, I'm going to push this a little bit, this is what specifies universality. Because it dictates what universality must be in order to be universality. It must be fully and completely, no more left over, differentiated into its various species. It must fully and completely, exhaustively specify it. In that sense, it's the principle. Particularity is not only the totality of universality, it is the principle that dictates what universality is, and therefore what it isn't. Now, if that makes a little bit of sense, then here's what and he talks more about this in the pages that follow, but take a look on 540 with me. Because here's where he introduces this problematic that he's going to focus on in the individuality discussion. Okay, 540, 43 in the German. This is right at the end, right before the remark. That's what I'm looking at, right before the remark. And he has this summary paragraph, right? You need these in Hegel, as we always know, right? Here's one, so let's climb on to it like we've done before. Since in the foregoing, right in the middle of the page, everybody see where I'm at on 540? Since in the foregoing the determinate concept has been presented in its truth, it is only left to indicate what, as so presented, it has already been posited as. So we just Let's just get clear about what we're showing it to be. We're saying universality just is this exhausted particularization of itself. So let's get clear about what that is. And he says, difference, which is an essential moment of the concept, but in the pure universal is not yet posited as such. It only gets posited as such in particularity. That's when it gets posited as such. He says, receives its due in the determinate concept. Determinateness in the form of universality is united with the latter, the determinate concept, to form a simple. It's a mere unity. Determinate universality is self-relating, you have self-referred, but self-relating determinateness. Determinateness, or absolute negativity, right? This is always where he's going back to. This is what it's doing. Posited for itself, not just embedded now, but now we can see it at work, right? That's what you mean when you talk about particularity is both the totality and the principle of universality, of the concept. So then he says this. So that's all by way of, that's all rehearsal. That's all, for Hegel, that's like, we got this, right? And that's review. We're good? Then he does what he standardly does. Having just reviewed the argument thus far, then he adds on. He builds on that. So look at what he says. But self-relating determinants. So he picks up that last moment, right? Self-relating determinants. That's where we're at. He says, that just is singularity. That just is individuality. How so? Just as universality immediately is particularity. Right? That's not that's not a relation. Right? That just is an identity claim. Universality is particularization. Just as universality immediately is particularity in and for itself, no less immediately is particularity also singularity. So there's the flow, right? There is no universality that isn't particularity. There is no particularization that isn't individuality, isn't singularity. But what does that last bit mean? What does that last bit mean? What does it mean to be the individuality of the concept, right? What does that mean? He says, no less immediately is particularity also singularity in and for itself. This singularity is at first, always caution, right? That's what Hegel's doing with that initially, right? Zunix, at first. This singularity is at first to be regarded as the third moment of the concept. So, okay, first moment, universality, second moment, particularity, this is the third moment, singularity, individuality. Inasmuch as it is held fast in opposition to the other two. He highlighted opposition to you. So you already know that's a problem, right? That can't be the way to really think of it, because why? He's just told you that universality is particularity, is individuality. So they're not opposed to one another. So initially when we talk about individuality, we're going to talk about it as though it were opposed to the others. But that's not its truth. So he says, is held fast into opposition to the other two, but also as the absolute turning back of the concept into itself. Okay. So there he's giving you both, right? He's saying, look, it's an opposition to the other two. It stands on its own, right? It's a distinct, separable moment unto itself. You can talk about individuality like that. You can talk about individual things like that, separable from universality particularizing itself. You can talk about this water bottle, right, unto itself, separated out from the universality particularizing itself, which this is. Right? But if you take it separable from that, then it has a kind of standaloneness about itself. You can oppose it to the other moments. Then you want to say, well, is that problem my problem? Or is that an epistemological problem? I can do that. I'm flawed. I'm mistaken. I'm the one who's messed up. And I said, oh, look, this is just my little, water bottle, this water bottle. But that's not how the truth is. That's not a problem in being. That's not an ontological problem. That's an epistemological my mistake problem. And Hegel's going to tell you it's not just an epistemological problem. It's not just, it is, but it's not just an epistemological problem. The understanding latches on the distinction that you can make, the opposition you can make between universality, particularity, and individuality. That's why the understanding can say, this is something unto itself. And it's separable from particularity and universality. And you want to say, well, Kevin, you're obsessed and consumed with your understanding. How feeble-minded of you, right? You don't see things in terms of speculative reason. When we all know, right, the ontological truth is universality particularizes itself, and one of the ways it particularizes itself is, guess what? That thing there. among all the other things that are as well. And you want to say, so the problem's you, Kev, it's not the thing. Hegel actually wants to say, that's why he's giving you both of these. He wants to say, it's not just an epistemological problem. It's an ontological problem as well. This is what's going to generate the issue with judgment. He's going to say that that individuality has two moments that are bound together in it. And those two moments, those two sides, those two aspects of individuality are these. Universality particularizes itself and comes to be itself, returns to itself, as he puts it here, in the moment of individuality. So if you want to see universality particularizing itself, there you go. There's individuality. But every individual is that as well. So we could just say individuals in general are universality particularizing itself. That's its totality, that's its principle at work, there you go, you see it. So that's the concept returning into itself, coming into relationship to itself. That's where the concept becomes itself. Because everything that is, every individual, everything that would fit into that logical category, individual, is a moment of that. But also, it's a loss of the concept. He says this, right? And he says, but also as the absolute turning back of the concept into itself. So that's that moment of universality coming to its completeness in individuality. Yay, wonderful. But it's not just that. It's also, he says, and at the same time, and notice he doesn't say, and because you're an idiot, because you've fallen down the rabbit hole of understanding, because none of that's the issue. Right? We can do that, right? The understanding does fixate on these oppositions, but it fixates on them because, not because it's mistaken simply, but because it's latching onto something as a feature of reality that's actually a feature of reality that's out there. And what is that? That you can separate these things. What he says, and at the same time as the posited loss of itself. It's the completion of the concept that's also at the same time the loss of the concept. So that, stay with my example, that water bottle there, this individual, is at one and the same time the completion, the fulfillment, the attainment, whatever the consummation, whatever the term you want to use for this is, of the concept coming to be what it is, through differentiating itself, its universality particularizing itself in and through and coming to be individuality. Here's one, but everything else is that too. You can pick up anything is, let me use this term very carefully because we're going to come back and learn this is a terrible way of expressing things, but everything is an instance of this. Let me put scare quotes around that because I don't like that term, but it at least makes the point, right? Everything is this. But also everything is just as equally the loss of the concept. Now you want to know why it's both, right? And the answer is not, well, one's the ontological truth, the other is the epistemological mistake. That's not how this works. Hegel's claim, as I read him, let's see what it says in the final section of this elaboration here, is that it's both because both are ontologically the case. Because the concept particularizes itself into individuality, because of that ontological truth, and not something that's gone wrong in the epistemology of trying to know it, but because it does that, it also is at the same time, right, simultaneity at the same time, is at the same time the fracturing of those concepts off into particular universal, particular particularity, particular individuality. So then you could say, oh, yeah, this bottle is related to the concept bottle, which stands over here separate from it. And it's particularized because it's made of plastic and has this particular kind of things that are wrapped around it, has this particular way of being configured. There you go. And you want to say, well, that's a problem of the understanding. It is a problem of the understanding, absolutely. But it has, Hegel's point here in the Science of Logic is that it's rooted in an ontological problematic that's already there, which is that when you just look at, when you look ontologically at universality particularizing itself into individuality, born within that same process is the possibility that you can extract each of those moments from that process. In other words, just to put it in the broadest terms, formalization is possible because of the nature of ontology itself. Formalization, the breaking apart. This is what he calls the descending and the ascending. We'll come back and look at this where he says this. But That's the point he's trying to make, is that individuality is both of those. And because it's the law, because it's all, it wants the completion and the loss, right? This is the point. Because individuality, the singular, as he puts it here, the singularity, is both the completion and the loss at the same time. And they're both, as I read it, see if I got it right. I go back to this all the time. It's one of the most, contentious moments in the logic, if you're trying to figure this out. Is this ontologically the case for both moments, or is one an ontological truth and the other is epistemological truth? I think both of them are ontological truths. So let's see how that works. And the latter of the two, that is the loss of the concept, that it's separatable, that you can isolate one moment over against another. This is the originary separation, the originary partition, the originary distinction. That's why you have to go talk about it in terms of the relation between one moment, universality, to another moment, singularity, to another moment, particularity. And that's what Urteil, right, originary separation, that's what judgment really is all about. It's about relating these moments to one another. Notice, if the culmination was simply the singular is the return of the concept into itself, we'd be done at least with the formal logic stuff. We wouldn't need to go any further. There'd be nothing else really to be talked about. We'd be done. But Hegel's convinced that that's not where we end this, because of the fact that the completion is also the possibility of its separation. So let's look at this. Here's what he says on 546. Page 546. So he says, this is on page 49 in the German, right at the beginning of the singular section. He says, singularity as we have seen, so he's talking about that passage we just looked at, is already posited through particularity. Right, so that's the claim, right? In a certain sense, you want to say, well, what else needs to be said here? Right? I mean, that's kind of been the message. There is no universality without particularization. Particularization, when it goes to its full extent, there is no more species to be found. Then what do you have? You have individuality. That's the full, complete totality and the principle of what it is to be the concept itself. Singularity, as we've seen, is already posited through particularity. This is determinate universality. Determinate universality is one of Hegel's other locutions for concrete universality. And hence he says, self-relating determinateness. This is the determinate determinateness. The determinate determinate. Like that tells you anything, but you really want to get something concrete. You really want to get something specified, have definition and specificity. What more do you need? We're done, right? It's over with. So then he starts unpacking that, right? And he doesn't tell you how he's going to unpack it until he really starts to do so. So look at what he says here, where he says, one, right? Next paragraph down, one. Then he says, at first, we've learned Hegel now, right? At first is always cautionary. Don't ever take him as word when he says at first. I mean, you want to take it, but that's not the final word, right? So he says, at first, therefore, because of what we've just shown, singularity, individuality, appears as the reflection of the concept out of its determinateness into itself. So it's a self-relation of universality back into itself in and through differentiation, in and through particularization. This is a story we've seen, but we've always been, falling back into the relata that it creates rather than the logic of the process itself. Now we got the process itself, so we're good, right? We're good, he says. It is the concept self-mediation by virtue of which, since its otherness has once more been made into another, it restores itself, so it generates its own otherness, right? Otherness is not something that happens to it, it's not something that befalls it, it's not negation is not something that overtakes it, it's not something that it's inflicted with, it's something that it generates out of itself. He says, it restores itself as self-equal. Self-equal really means self-identical, right? Self-same. But in the determination of absolute negativity. Now that last little clause, right, incredibly important. He's invoking the notion of absolute negativity. We know that that's the hinge on, arguably, the entire science of logic works. So why is he pointing that out here? But in the determination of absolute negativity. Because he's about to unpack what that entails. So it all looks good, right? But this is the work of absolute negativity, so this means something. He's about to build on it. Here's what he does. The negative in the universal, by virtue of which this universal is a particular, was early determined as a doubly reflexive shine. So if you go back and look, this is this is back on 35 in the German. This is the top of page 533, it's just before you get into 36, where he calls it the doubly reflexive shine, both outwards, right? It has both of these moments. He's about to unpack this now. So he's basically telling you, look, we noted this, that to particularize means to reach completion, but it doesn't just mean to reach completion. Absolute negativity generates alterity, generates otherness, generates differentiation, but it also does something else. It has both of these moments. So he says, insofar as the reflective shining is inward, the particular remains a universal. Okay, the particular remains a universal. So this is the particular as totality, as principle, all good. Through the outward shining, it is a determinate particular. A determinate particular. Now, notice, not particularity, not particularization, but a determinate particular. We're about to call this a this, right? An individual in that sense. He says, through the outward shining is a determinate particular. The turning back of this side into the universal is twofold, either by virtue of an abstraction that lets the particular fall away and climbs to a higher and higher genus, or by virtue of the singularity to which the universality and the determinate itself descends. So look at what he's just put in place through this outward double shining, right? This is, in my view, if you look back on 533, right, that's a ticking time bomb. Right? That's what he's now saying. Boom, it went off, right? And what does it mean? It means this. It means that singularity is, not can be treated as, but is two things. The completion of universality such that it comes to be itself, the return of the concept into itself. So this just is universality. There is no universality in and above this. This is just one feature of universality expressing itself. So it is that. But the other side of it is that it's also determinate this. That means, as I read it, it can stand on its own. Ontologically. Ontologically it can stand on its own. That whole process doesn't have to be there for this thing to stand. But that's not an epistemological claim. That is an ontological claim. I'm pushing this because one way you can read this stuff is to say, oh yeah, you can get screwed up about this. You can be misled by this. But that's an epistemological mistake you're making. I don't think that's what Hegel is saying, actually. Hegel is staying with the ontological level. He doesn't, delve off or divert off into the epistemological. He knows the difference. He operates with it all the time. And so he wants to say, this isn't an epistemological mistake. This is an ontological feature. I wouldn't even call it a flaw. This is much like, when we talk about bad infinite. Right? Bad infinite is not that there aren't really those infinites out there. There are those kinds of infinites, the ongoing infinites like that, the ongoing, the one more. That's out there. That's ontologically real. It's just produced by an infinitizing process that generates that one more and one more and one more. Here, similarly, we're talking about that same kind of, broadly speaking, phenomenon, same kind of problem now. He says, next line down, here's where the false start is made that makes abstraction stray away from the way of the concept. So now he's, in my view, he's saying, here's the ontological ground by which that epistemological mistake is made. Stray away from the way of the concept, abandoning the truth. Its higher and highest universal to which it rises is only a surface that becomes progressively more void of content. The singularity which it scorns is the depth in which the concept grasps itself and where it is posited as concept. Now, he said, look, you can think about this in two ways then. Right? You can think about this as the concept descends into particularity and comes to be itself. And also, it's abstractable. It ascends. It's ascendable. You can take it out. That's a word. You can take it out of that particularity. You can abstract it, extract it from it. Well, if it descends into it, it completes itself in it, then you've got the return of the concept into itself. Yes? So all we're saying at that point is that universality particularizes itself into individuality, and individuality just names the completion of universality's coming to be itself in and through particularization. So you could say, and you rightly say, for Hegel, ontologically speaking, that everything that exists is the concept, it is universality particularizing itself. So everything you can point at, right, is just that process going on, and therefore it is the concept coming into its own, it's coming into be itself. Every last bit of it is that. And yet, you can also, because of that same process, this is let me use terms that he doesn't use, detachable from that process, separatable from that process. Let me use a term he does use. You can partition this. You can take this apart from that process. Well, what would you have then? Well, as he says now, take a look on 548 with me, then we'll take a break. Take a look on 548. This is right at 51, so it's just below, it's just before 2, right? The number 2, right, just in the middle of the page. And just after the hyphen you have there, in singularity, the earlier true relation. Everybody see where I'm at? Just above 51, the mark for 51 in German. So he writes, in singularity, the earlier true relation, the inseparability, excuse me, he emphasizes inseparability because he's about to talk about the separability. Yep. The inseparability of the determinations of the concept is positive. 4, as negation of the negation, singularity contains the opposition of those determinations, and this opposition is itself as its ground or the unity where the determinations have come together, each in the other. It just is nothing other than that process. That's just what it is. All those moments are packed into one another. Then he says, because in this reflection, universality is in and for itself. Singularity is essentially the negativity of the determinations of the concept, but not merely as if it stood as a third something distinct from them. That's going to become the problem, right? If you're looking at it this way, if you're looking at it, universality particularizes itself into individuality, where individuality just names the completion of that universalized particularization process, then you're just saying it can't stand on its own. It's not separable on its own. It can't stand on its own. It just is that moment of completion. That's all it is. But not as it is, as if it stood as a third something distinct from them, but because what is now posited is that positiveness is being in and for itself. It just is what that thing is. That is, what is posited is that each of the distinct determinations is the totality. So going back to that notion of particularization is totality. Every moment of differentiation, anything that's different, all the diverse objects of the world are just moments of that particularization. Therefore, they are the totality. Then he says, the turning back of the determinate concept into itself means that its determination is to be in its determinateness the whole concept. So it comes to its completion, right? This is what it means to be the concept, not just universal, not just particular, but individuality as well. All three of those are really flow into one another. You can't have one without the other, not in the sense that they're relata, but in the sense that universality just is particularization, particularization just is individuality, just is singularity. Yes? Good? Makes sense? That's the returns into itself side. But then he immediately says this, too. Singularity is not, however, only the turning back. He just said it's the turning back. It's not only the turning back of the concept into itself, but the immediate loss of it. Where does that loss come from? Look what he says in the rest of this paragraph, then we'll take a break. Through singularity, where it is internal to itself, that is where the singularity, we're just considering on its own, right? When it's unto itself, when it's reached that moment of completion. The concept becomes external to itself and steps into actuality. Abstraction, which is a soul of singularity and soul to self-relation of the negative, is, as we have seen, he just talked about it earlier, right? This is the reflecting outward, reflecting inward. Reflecting outward is the abstraction moment, not descending but ascending. As we've seen, nothing external to the universal and the particular, but is immanent in them. This is why I think this is ontological, not epistemological. This is a feature endemic to the process itself, not something you do with it and make a mistake with it. This is a feature endemic to the process itself. Nothing external to the universal and the particular, but is immanent in them, and these are concreted through it. They become a content, a singular. But as this negativity, singularity is the determinate determinateness, differentiation as such. And through this reflection of the difference into itself, the difference becomes, here's the big word, fixed. The contrast is between inseparability. You can't, universality is particularity, particularity is individuality. The inseparability of them. The immediate identification, well, immediate too much, but identification of all of them with one another, yes? But here, because of that same feature, nothing different, not something we did mistakenly, the brain got, fixed out on this thing, the understanding ran off. No, this is a feature of the ontology itself, is that it can become fixed. The determining of the particular, he says, occurs only by virtue of singularity. For singularity is that abstraction. Not we take it abstractly, it is that abstraction, which precisely as singularity is now posited abstraction. So there's a danger, I'm using terms he doesn't use. There's a danger built into the ontology of the concept. What is that danger? That danger is that the ontology of the concept, which is inseparable, right? Universality particularizes itself and thereby is individuality. That's the inseparability of those. The danger is because of how that operates, because of how that works, because it all reaches a culmination in some object, some instance, let's use that term very broadly. What can happen is you can fix, right? They are separable from one another. They can become rigid, separated from one another. You can then talk about that different from the particularization of it, different than the universality of it. That's what it means to ascend now from the particular back to the universal. That's abstraction. You'll say, well, that's something we do. Right, but we do it because it's predicated on an ontological structure that's embedded in the nature of reality itself. Abstraction is not something that we mistakenly do to being. It's something that being allows to be done to itself. It endangers itself in doing so. Right? I'm using threat language that Hegel's not using, but I think it accurately reflects what he is talking about. That we can become fixated on talking about concepts in this way, as concepts are the universals that get particularized into individuals. And you'll say, well, that's a mistake of the understanding. That's true, it is. But it's not just the understanding that makes that mistake. It makes that mistake because it's planted in the very nature of reality itself, that because universality particularizes itself into individuality, and individuality is, so to speak, the result, that the result can, so to speak, stand on its own. It's the determinate particular, that you result in what? This. What Aristotle famously called the to, right? This thing that just stands there on its own. That there is no science of it because we can't talk about a science of individuals. We can only do a science of universals and how they get particularized out into species. But we can't do individuals because individuals are, beyond that. Well, here's the ontological underpinnings of that are in the very nature of this process of differentiation. Differentiation bears its own risk of being characterized in a non-processional way as merely this concept relates to that concept, relates to that concept. He says in the next paragraph down, the singular, therefore, is a self-relating negativity. The immediate identity of the negative with itself, it exists for itself. There it stands on its own. That's what exists for itself means, right? It stands on its own. That means it doesn't need this, crazy particularization process we've been talking about. All that can kind of, fall by the wayside, right? Because it's really not endemic to it at this moment. Of course it is, but it's not. Or it is the abstraction determining the concept as an immediate, according to its ideal moment of being. Thus the singular is a one that is qualitative, or a this. And he gives you the analysis, as I mentioned last time, of sense certainty again. You can do this at the epistemological level. That's what he does on 549 under German 52. The this is, it is immediate, is the this, however, only insofar as it is pointed at, right? Because you can't say it's here or now because that's all universals. So I can just go, profound insight from Hegel and the phenomenology, and it's pointing at this. But here you get the ontological underpinnings for what that, in the phenomenology, which is a epistemological text, elaborates epistemologically. Right? We're trying to point at, we're trying to have reference to the singular, and we can't because we're always bound by universal categories and concepts like time and space, the here and the now. Here he's saying, well, that's not just a consciousness problem. It is a consciousness problem, but it's not just a consciousness problem. That's an ontology problem. Because the way the ontological process works is it consummates in singularity. And singularity is the determinate, it's particular determinacy, it's particular individual. And that means it exists on its own. So it's abstractable. That's a feature of it ontologically itself. So what we've just seen now is that individuality is at one and the same time both the culmination of the concept, universality particularizing itself in individuality, but it's also the loss of that concept, the loss of that process. The loss of it means the devolving of it into these three abstractable moments where there's the individual, here's its particularity, and there's its universality. Now, the final paragraph on 549, I promise we'll take a break after this. Because this goes to the question of why do we then go to Urteil. The concept as this is the last paragraph in 549, 52 in the journal. This concept as this connection of its self-subsistent determinations, that is, universality, particularity, singularity, that's the self-subsistent determinations, has lost itself. So you can know anytime someone's saying, well, universality, and then it could get particularized, and then, it might be individualized from that. You can know right away we're not talking about the processional nature of the true nature of the concept, right? So anyone who tells you that the concept is universality that particularizes, and then when it gets particularized, it gets concretized, then it becomes individual, that's one flow. That's not two stages of three moments. It's lost itself, for the concept itself is no longer the posited unity of these determinations. It's no longer that. And these no longer are moments, the reflective shining of the concept, but subsist rather in and for themselves. Each one of them. Universality subsists unto itself, particularity subsists for itself, so does the individual. They're all able to stand on their own as virtues. As singularity, the concept returns and determines into itself, and therewith the determinate has itself become totality. The concept turning back into itself is thus the absolute originary, so here's the loss now, partitioning of itself, the separation of itself, the originative partitioning of itself. So here's Urteilen, right? That's literally what that means. So I would say that before he names it Urteil and says we now need to go talk about Urteil, judgment, he's got the ontological demonstration of what that is. And then he says, oh, and that is the originary separability of these three moments that judgment does grapple with. Judgment is all about how do you relate now these things that flowed into one another, how do you actually relate them to one another? And that's what a judgment is. It's about relating universality to individuality through particularity, or relating particularity to universality through individuality. It's all those kinds of ways in which you can now take the three self-subsistent moments and relate them to one another. That's why judgment's entailed by concept, because concept is necessarily the originary separatableness of its three moments from the flow that it fundamentally is. And that's an ontological moment, not just an epistemological moment. All right, enough for now. Let's take a 10-minute break. It's 4:39. Let's come back at 4:49. I'll see you then, and we'll work our way through now the forms of judgment from there.